August 10th, 2026, Monday. New York City is already shifting into US Open mode, even though the main draw at Flushing Meadows is still 2 full weeks away. Sponsor crews are moving across the grounds. Production teams are setting up. Hospitality structures are going up around Arthur Ashe Stadium. And the entire complex is beginning to look like the commercial machine that arrives every summer before the first meaningful ball is struck. Thousands of miles away in Melbourne, the scene could not be more different. Australia is in the middle of winter. Rod Laver Arena is quiet. The Australian Open is not around the corner, it is roughly 5 months away. Yet, somewhere between a Grand Slam preparing to begin and another Grand Slam that finished months earlier, Marriott's Asia-Pacific operation releases a relatively simple announcement. There is no giant contract number splashed across the headline, no dramatic reveal about how many years the agreement lasts, no breathless list of luxury benefits. Instead, the central message is straightforward. Alex Eala has become the face of Marriott Bonvoy's Tennis the World campaign across Asia-Pacific, excluding China. And the date is what should immediately grab your attention. Marriott makes the move roughly 10 days before the US Open, rather than waiting to see what Eala does in New York. That may sound like a small detail, but in sports marketing it is anything but, because the usual strategy is almost always the reverse. Brands wait for the breakthrough. They wait for the trophy. They wait for the viral highlights, the ranking jump, the celebration photos, the television interviews, and the spike in attention. Then the checks come out. Marriott did not wait. It placed its bet early. And when a global hospitality company of that scale commits to a 21-year-old player sitting around number 20 in the world before the biggest American tournament of the summer even begins, the most interesting question is not the salary. The better question is what Marriott believes it understands about Alex Eala that the broader sponsorship market has not fully valued yet. That is the real story here, not simply that a tennis player signed another endorsement agreement, but when the agreement happened, where Marriott intends to use her, and what the company appears to be trying to build around her. A lot of coverage will naturally reduce. This to the familiar formula: famous athlete, famous company, endorsement announcement, congratulations, move on. That interpretation is easy, and it gives you a clean headline, but it misses the strategic layer, and more importantly, it may miss a clue about where Eala's commercial career could be headed over the next several years, rather than just the next several tournaments. Contract value can be negotiated. Contract length can be adjusted. Benefits can be packaged creatively. Press releases can make almost anything sound enormous. But the date on which a company chooses to enter cannot be rewritten later. Timing reveals conviction. Timing reveals risk tolerance. Timing tells you whether the company is chasing momentum that already exists or attempting to position itself before the rest of the market catches up. Marriott chose a very particular moment to move on Alex Eala. And understanding that moment tells us more about what the company thinks she represents than any unverified dollar figure floating around social media. For anyone who hasn't followed the rise closely, the background matters. Alex Eala is a 21-year-old professional from the Philippines who turned professional in 2020 after spending formative years developing at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca. Before the summer of 2026, she was already viewed as one of the more interesting young players on tour, with a committed fan base, increasing recognition, and a ranking moving steadily upward. Then came a stretch of roughly 6 weeks that completely changed the way she was being discussed. At Wimbledon, she defeated defending champion Iga Swiatek in the 3rd round, winning 7-6, 6-2 on center court. That was not a quiet result buried on an outside court. It was the type of match millions of tennis fans notice, because it combines the most famous stage in the sport with the shock of a young player taking down the reigning champion. Then came Washington at the DC Open in early August. Eala produced the most significant tournament run of her career, defeating Jessica Pegula, Alina Svitolina, and Naomi Osaka on the way to her first WTA singles title. In doing so, she became the first Filipino player to win a WTA singles championship. When the rankings were updated on August 4th, one day after the trophy ceremony, she had climbed to world number 20, the best ranking of her career and reportedly the highest position ever achieved by a Filipino player on either professional tour. 6 days after that update, Marriott announced her. Those dates matter because they establish exactly where the market stood when the company made its decision. And this is where several things about the deal begin looking unusual. Start with the first contradiction. If Marriott's main objective was simply to benefit from a possible Eala run at the US Open, the timing is strange. The obvious promotional move would be to wait if she reaches the second week, makes a quarterfinal, beats another major name, or creates a viral New York moment, then you announce the partnership into a much louder media cycle. Brands do this constantly because the tournament supplies free momentum. Marriott instead committed before the event. Even more interesting, Eala was not entering the announcement directly off a victory. Her most recent result had been a fourth-round defeat to Belinda Bencic in Canada. Yet even that loss contained another signal. The Toronto night session featuring Eala reportedly sold roughly 3,100 tickets in less than half an hour after her appearance was announced. Remember that number because it gives us a glimpse of what companies are probably measuring that traditional tennis analysis does not always capture. Still, the broader point remains, Marriott acted before New York. That was a deliberate decision. Now consider the second oddity. The campaign Eala is fronting is called Tennis the World, but its most important Grand Slam connection is not the US Open, Wimbledon, or Roland Garros. The campaign is tied closely to the Australian Open, where Marriott Bonvoy is heading into its 6th consecutive year as an official hotel partner. The 2027 Australian Open is scheduled for January 11th through January 31st, and one of the concrete benefits promoted through Marriott Bonvoy is early access to tickets for that tournament. In other words, Marriott takes a 21-year-old player riding enormous attention during the American hardcourt summer and signs her to support a campaign whose key tournament activation sits in Melbourne about 5 months later. Again, why then? There is a third unusual detail. Marriott did not simply label Eala its ambassador for Asia-Pacific. The company repeatedly uses the wording Asia-Pacific, excluding China. That exclusion is important. China is one of the largest tennis markets in Asia by virtually every relevant commercial measure, major tournaments, enormous audiences, major sponsors, a substantial piece of the WTA calendar. If a company wants one player to represent tennis across Asia-Pacific in the broadest possible sense, including China would seem obvious. Marriott intentionally does not do that. Instead, Eala's territory essentially centers on markets such as Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, Japan, and Korea, while China sits outside the assignment. Why create that boundary? And then comes the fourth clue, one that has been obscured by the flood of exaggerated posts around the announcement. Marriott's official material does not disclose a contract value. It does not say she is receiving $2 million annually. It does not confirm unlimited first-class flights. It does not announce a $287 million package. Those claims may be circulating online, but they do not appear in Marriott's own announcement, Marriott's campaign information, or the more credible business coverage of the partnership. The actual benefits emphasized publicly are directed toward Marriott Bonvoy members, Australian Open ticket access, Marriott Bonvoy moments, and exclusive experiences. That distinction is revealing. The public-facing structure of the partnership is not built around showing what Alex Eala personally receives from Marriott. It is built around showing what Marriott customers can receive through Bonvoy. That raises the more interesting question, why is Marriott attempting to bring its members closer to Eala, rather than simply using Eala to display a Marriott logo? Put all four questions together, and the usual interpretation starts to look incomplete. The normal sponsorship story goes something like this. Athlete becomes popular, brand notices athlete, brand pays athlete, athlete lends fame and visibility to the company. That is probably part of what is happening. But it does not explain the specificity of this agreement. A better way to understand it is that Marriott may not primarily be buying exposure from a rising tennis star. Marriott may be using Alex Eala as a credible bridge into a strategically important consumer region. Tennis becomes the vehicle. Eala becomes the cultural and emotional connection. The business objective is deeper adoption of Marriott Bonvoy among travelers across the part of Asia-Pacific where the company clearly wants loyalty growth. Once you look at it through that lens, the timing, the Melbourne focus, the China exclusion, and the member benefits all begin fitting together. Marriott does not have to wait for Eala to win another Grand Slam-level match because the company is not purchasing one tournament's momentum. It is investing in the idea that she can become a durable regional sports figure. The Australian Open suddenly makes sense because it is the slam geographically and culturally closest to many Southeast Asian travelers. Excluding China makes sense because the campaign territory can correspond directly to the markets Marriott wants to target separately. And the emphasis on benefits for Bonvoy members makes sense because customer enrollment and loyalty engagement appear to be a major objective. That changes the entire framing. Instead of Marriott simply placing its name beside Alex Eala, it is potentially embedding her into the way the company wants to attract and engage customers. That is a far bigger statement than a standard endorsement photograph. Companies can put almost any successful athlete in an advertisement. They become much more selective when an athlete is expected to help open or deepen a market. And when that is the strategy, the most important financial question is no longer what the athlete earns today. It becomes how valuable the company believes the audience around that athlete can become tomorrow. There are at least 3 pieces of evidence supporting this interpretation. The first is the calendar and how different Marriott's move looks compared with one of the most famous recent tennis sponsorship explosions. After Emma Raducanu won the 2021 US Open as a qualifier, brands rushed in. Over the following weeks and months, she became associated with a long list of global names, including Tiffany, Dior, Vodafone, Evian, British Airways, Porsche, and HSBC. Those companies were entering after the breakthrough, effectively buying at post-US Open prices, when global attention was at its maximum. For years, marketing analysts have debated what that sponsorship rush meant and whether too much commercial value had been attached to one extraordinary tournament before the durability of the athletic results could be known. Coverage surrounding the Eala Marriott partnership has already drawn comparisons to that period. But Marriott appears to have taken the other side of the strategy. Instead of waiting for Eala to produce another New York explosion and potentially seeing her price multiply, it acted while she was ranked 20th and before the tournament began. That is not a bet on one viral fortnight. It looks much more like a bet on the underlying market around the athlete. Evidence number 2 is hidden in the corporate language. Marriott's chief commercial officer for Asia-Pacific, excluding China, did not build his public explanation mainly around future trophies or rankings. The comments highlighted qualities such as authenticity, inspiration, and, crucially, Eala's connection to the region Marriott serves. That final part is the line worth paying attention to. Corporate press releases are filled with polished language, but senior executives usually reveal priorities through what they choose to emphasize. Marriott could have described Eala as a potential future Grand Slam winner. It could have focused entirely on her recent tennis achievements. Instead, the company stresses regional connection. That language aligns much more closely with a market strategy than a simple performance-based endorsement. Tennis gets Marriott attention. Regional identity gives the attention relevance, and the region itself is one Marriott has repeatedly identified as extremely important to the future of its loyalty business. That brings us to the third and strongest piece of evidence, Marriott's own research. Earlier in 2026, Marriott Bonvoy published loyalty trend data for Asia-Pacific, excluding China. Notice the wording. It is the same regional definition used in Eala's ambassador announcement. According to that research, 89% of travelers surveyed across the region participated in at least one loyalty program, with the figure reaching 96% in Vietnam. Those are remarkable numbers because they show Marriott is not trying to introduce the idea of travel loyalty to a population unfamiliar with it. The opposite is true. This is an audience already conditioned to join programs, collect benefits, compare experiences, and reward the brands with which they feel the strongest connection. In an environment like that, the battle is not simply persuading people to understand loyalty. The battle is persuading them to choose your loyalty ecosystem over someone else's. Then Marriott selects a 21-year-old Filipino athlete whose popularity is growing rapidly across exactly that broader geographic area and installs her as a face of the Bonvoy tennis campaign. Suddenly, the structure becomes extremely clean. Move before another slam has the chance to reset the athlete's commercial price. Define her territory using the same regional boundary your market research uses. Choose someone whose identity is naturally connected to Southeast Asia and whose supporters extend well beyond the Philippines because of a large diaspora and a growing international tennis audience. Link the campaign to the Australian Open, the Grand Slam that is easiest for large parts of Asia-Pacific to engage with in terms of geography and time zone, and then make one of the headline campaign benefits early Australian Open access for Bonvoy members. Now imagine the consumer journey. A traveler in Manila, Singapore, Bangkok, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Seoul, Tokyo, or another city in the region wants to watch Alex Eala compete at the slam most accessible to them. Marriott can connect that desire to Bonvoy membership, ticket opportunities, hotel stays, experiences, and loyalty engagement. From a business perspective, that is closer to a customer acquisition system than a conventional athlete endorsement. Alex Eala is sitting at the top of the funnel, but the destination of the funnel is Marriott Bonvoy. And once you see that, those 4 confusing details no longer look confusing at all. They become connected parts of one strategy. It doesn't have to be interpreted cynically. In fact, it can be seen as an enormous vote of confidence. Companies do not normally build multi-year customer strategies around personalities they expect to disappear from relevance in 6 months. If Marriott is positioning Eala this way, it suggests the company believes her appeal can survive individual wins and losses. It suggests they are not betting exclusively on her becoming a Grand Slam champion next month. They are betting that several years from now she can still be one of the sports figures most strongly associated with a fast-growing audience they want to reach. That is arguably a bigger compliment than simply rewarding her for a trophy she already won. Marriott evaluated Alex Eala around world number 20, just before the US Open, and appears to have decided that waiting carried more risk than moving early. That is a meaningful commercial bet. But there are limits to what the evidence allows us to claim, and those limits matter. Nothing about this analysis proves Marriott knew what Eala would do in New York. Her actual US Open result was respectable rather than transformational. She defeated 14th seed Clara Tauson in the first round in a 3-set battle, reportedly surviving breakpoint pressure and recovering from a 5-1 deficit in the deciding tiebreak before losing in round 2 to Cristina Bavana. That is a solid slam showing, but it is not the kind of tournament that would have doubled her market value overnight. If Marriott had delayed its announcement by 2 weeks, it probably could still have signed her at a similar commercial level. So the smart part of the timing is not that Marriott magically predicted a spectacular US Open. The smarter interpretation is that the company deliberately refused to make its decision dependent on what happened at one US Open. There is an important difference between predicting a tournament and deciding that the tournament does not matter enough to change your long-term thesis. The partnership also does not guarantee that Eala will remain ranked number 20. Rankings move quickly. Tennis can be unforgiving, particularly for a 21-year-old carrying expectations from an entire nation while also adjusting to dramatically greater media attention. The loss to Bensick in Canada before the Marriott announcement was a legitimate defeat, in which a more experienced player solved problems Eala could not completely answer. More results like that will happen. There will be weeks when she loses early. There will be opponents who expose tactical weaknesses. There will be physical and mental pressure. Eala herself has spoken, after her Washington success, about continuing to improve rather than assuming future results are automatically guaranteed. That matters, because the commercial argument here should not depend on pretending she is invincible. Marriott does not need her to win every week for the strategy to work. It needs her to remain culturally relevant, competitively credible, and emotionally important to the audience the company wants to reach. There is another thing we simply do not know: the value of the contract. No reliable public source has attached a confirmed dollar figure to the deal. Marriott did not announce a specific package value. It did not confirm unlimited luxury airfare or any unlimited first-class arrangement. If you see large numbers repeated without sourcing, treat them as speculation rather than established reporting. That uncertainty may actually strengthen the point because the amount is less important than people assume. Whether Marriott is paying one number or another does not alter the regional territory. It does not alter the Australian Open tie-in. It does not alter the decision to announce before the US Open. It does not alter Marriott's loyalty research. And it does not alter the fact that Eala is being deployed as the public face of a campaign aimed at a highly strategic travel market. Eventually, a contract number may leak and people will turn it into another headline, but the number could end up being the least revealing element of the entire partnership. What matters now is the type of room Alex Eala has entered. We tend to imagine athlete success through stadiums, trophies, locker rooms, and ranking tables. But there is another room that becomes just as important when a player crosses a certain commercial threshold, the conference room where executives study customer demographics, travel behavior, geographic growth, loyalty data, fan engagement, and brand fit. Marriott operates roughly 9,000 properties worldwide. Somewhere inside an organization of that size, decision-makers looked at a market containing hundreds of millions of consumers, looked at a young Filipino tennis player who had just reached world number 20, and concluded that those two things belonged in the same commercial strategy. That is a different level of relevance. And once one major company publicly reaches that conclusion, other companies watch, airlines watch, financial services companies watch, apparel groups watch, luxury brands watch, consumer electronics companies watch, travel platforms watch, other hotel groups watch. This pattern has appeared before with players whose commercial profile ultimately expanded well beyond the tennis court. Naomi Osaka is an obvious example of an athlete whose sponsorship portfolio accelerated dramatically once companies realized her value was not limited to winning matches. Coco Gauff has followed a similar pattern in her own way. Once an athlete becomes recognized as a cultural bridge to a valuable demographic, every new partnership influences the next negotiation. Marriott moving first creates validation. The next brand considering Eala can now point to Marriott's decision as evidence that another global company has already performed its own analysis and decided her audience matters. If a second major company joins, then two companies validate the thesis. If a third follows, momentum compounds. Commercial markets often work exactly that way. One deal changes the conditions for the next deal. That means the ambassador announcement in August 2026 may eventually be remembered less for whatever Marriott paid, and more because it marked the moment Alex Eala's commercial category changed. She was no longer merely a promising young tennis player attracting endorsements because of results. She became someone a multinational company was willing to use as a regional growth asset.